And I think we are evolving from this sort of, one leader to many model to this idea that we all have our own innate, intrinsic leadership styles. And I think it's those conscious leaders that can really empower, with less of the ego for this is about me, but truly, what is it that I can offer in service of that person to, developing and going on and becoming their own version of their leadership.
Welcome to today's episode. I'm thrilled to have with us Amy Sandler, an executive coach, corporate mindfulness trainer, and professional speaker with over 20 years of experience in senior roles. Amy is the lead coach and podcast host at Radical Candor, bringing her expertise in leadership and communication to audiences worldwide. She holds an MBA from Harvard University, an MFA in Screenwriting from UCLA, and she is a certified teacher of Search Inside Yourself, Google's leadership program. So welcome, Amy. I'm really glad to be with you.
I'm excited to have this conversation. Thank you for having me.
So Amy, before we get started, I would like to ask you, how did you get started teaching mindfulness in the workplace? I understood that you are a certified CELI program and combining it today.
Yeah, I love that question because I think it can be helpful to reflect on how we got there, and also for folks who are interested in pursuing more of that in the workplace, sort of connecting the dots. And so it's something, mindfulness, breath work, Qigong, all sorts of different healing techniques, yoga, etc. I've been practicing on and off for, at this point now, more than 30 years. I got my first mantra when I was an undergraduate student. But at the time, that was not something that was in the workplace. It was sort of two different work streams. There was my personal and spiritual development, and there was my getting my MBA and becoming, a leader in marketing and communications, which was my field of expertise. So there were really kind of two parallel processes where I was doing all of this meditation training and practice. And then I was kind of showing up at work. And I would find that I would feel really just so connected and free of stress after a retreat. And then all of a sudden, Monday morning, I would be back at work. And it was like nothing had changed. And I was really curious, exploring how can I start to marry and unite these two things. And I learned about a program called, as you mentioned, Search Inside Yourself. It was an internal program developed at Google, and they were opening it up to people outside of Google to be able to teach that outside. And so I was selected as one of the first 30 certified teachers of this program. This was 10 years ago. This was 2014. And really at the time, I think it was the first, if not one of the first programs that really married neuroscience, mindfulness and compassion practices, and the emotional intelligence that is needed for leadership development. And it really came from a very interesting aha. I don't know if you know this backstory, but they first tried to introduce mindfulness-based stress reduction to Google engineers, which you and your listeners might know, sort of an 8-week program introducing mindfulness developed by John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts, based on stress reduction and working in more hospital settings. But what they found was that at the time, Google engineers didn't want to reduce their stress because they thought this was the thing that got them to be so successful. And so it was when they realized they had this aha that, as Dan Goleman might say, that the awareness that we can cultivate from practicing mindfulness is actually quite similar to self-awareness, which is really the foundation of emotional intelligence. And so when they married the practices and united it in a leadership development program, that's really how it took off and how people saw the value. And so that was the program that I was certified to teach. And that was, once I started doing that, it empowered me to not just, teach a retreat to some colleagues at work, but to really start to bring these practices in a more formal setting to CEOs and to other leaders.
And I know from your background that you have walked on fire 6 times, right? And this resonates and connects to mindfulness and presence. So can you share with us What your
Yeah.
experience? What did you learn from this amazing experience?
Yeah. I teach breathwork meditation as well. And I have done the firewalking with my breathwork teacher, David Elliott. It's now up to 7 times. We'll see if it'll be an 8th time this New Year's. It's something that I've done going into the new year, which for your listeners is a kind of high desert. So in the turn of December into January, this very sacred time around the world, there's a lot of snow, it's cold. And the way the fire walking happens, and by the way, I would only do this with David. So I think it's important, someone you trust. It's like anything where you're really pushed out of your comfort zone. Who is that person that's guiding you? Who are the people, the sort of community or cohort that you're going through with, kind of your team. And nature is a really important part of this. So David has been cultivating the relationship with the land and the sun and the stars and the trees and all of the elements that actually go into the fire itself. And one of the things that happens in the fire walk is that beforehand you get into this somewhat altered state through doing the breathing meditation. You've really identified the goals, the things that you want to let go of, kind of leave and allow them to actually burn in the fire. So there's already all this preparation. Like you notice, I haven't even talked about the actual firewalk itself, because so much of this, and I think in the workplace, so often we think about like the one thing, right? Rather than the practice, the reps that take us into the moment. And the moment itself is really remarkable, and I can get to the moment, but I think just thinking about those beginnings and ends, as well as when we're sort of in that moment itself. And so you're already in this state of presence. You look up at a star, and invariably, even when it's been really cloudy, there's always been something. And the point is to really anchor you. It's kind of like setting your intention. What's your North Star for yourself, for your company? And so it'll be a word or a phrase. I've done things like love. I've done things like sacred year, abundance. Once I did, David always asks you right before you go, are you ready? And I said, I'm ready. And then all of a sudden that became my phrase for the year. I hadn't meant it to be, but that was what it became. And so you've got the group that you're with, 10, 20, 30 people on the side of these burning hot coals. You're looking up at the star, and then you go off and you run across the coals. I run. It's long enough that if you, I am not good at metric, but it's, there's probably 15 people standing, side by side, could be on the side. There's people at the end to kind of greet you and hold you as you're going across the coals, and then other people tending to you in like bathing the feet. And so there's something very sacred about it. What I think happens in that moment is you're chanting to yourself, my body will do whatever it must to let me walk on fire. And the group is chanting that as well. And so you're kind of in that state with that intention setting. And then you shift up to whatever you've decided in the star. And I think looking up the star is really helpful, because if you look down, your brain will say, danger, danger, I'm walking on hot coals. And that is how we tend to get burned. I've never gotten burned. I've never even really gotten much of anything except this remarkable thing that shows me, wow, these beliefs that we have sometimes can be counteracted, and just again that curiosity. And part of why I do it, Karen, is because if I'm going to be teaching people to get out of their comfort zones, I like to do things that push me out of my comfort zone. The last thing I'll say on that is that David will always say at the start of any retreat, like, I don't need to do, he's from Kentucky, so he's got this kind of American Southern accent. I don't need to do this. Like, we don't need to do it. So there's no pressure. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to do it. And I think that's also very important. That is it a stretch out of my comfort zone, like my challenge zone, versus like too far out, like a panic zone kind of thing.
Wow. So I love this experience that you're sharing with us. And I want to connect it to conscious leadership and what you said right now. So what I heard really, first of all, putting an intention, right? Having an intention, a star north star to look forward to. So the intention, it's really important, right? So once you put an intention, you know where you want to head. And the second thing that I heard you say that's really crucial is having a community, a support system, trusting the people that you are with them, right? Because to do it alone, it's more challenging. But once I think, I also came now from, as I told you in the beginning, from a retreat in Mexico with Dr. Joe Dispenza. And there was like 2,500 people there. So it was
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people. So I think the energy in the room, it's such a supportive environment, and you can go so much deeper than you can go alone, right? So I think the environment, the people around you are
Yep.
the community is so crucial, also in the workplace. And the third thing that I heard you say, it's to enable. Like you say, David, don't push us to the edge. He enables us to space and give us to our free choice to do it. And if we feel panic, we won't do it. So I think this is also a critical characteristic of a conscious leader, that he enables the space and create the guidance. What do you think about it?
Absolutely. Yeah. When I reflect a lot on those elements of the firewalk and exactly the intention, the group, and then especially around what does it mean to be a conscious leader, an empowering leader where you're really a guide. The other piece is that, you're also in this moment, you are demonstrating expertise or leadership and knowing that in another moment, in another setting, someone else is picking up the reins. And so I think this idea of the cohort, the team, the people that you were with in the retreat setting, knowing that I'm sure there were a lot of, everyone in that room is a leader. And I think we are evolving from this sort of, one leader to many model to this idea that we all have our own innate, intrinsic leadership styles. And I think it's those conscious leaders that can really empower, with less of the ego for this is about me, but truly what is it that I can offer in service of that person to, developing and going on and becoming their own version of their leadership. And I think that is really that other piece that certainly I've observed in David, and as he's done other trainings so that other people can bring on their own flavors, that we all have that spark. And I keep learning by teaching, right? And so I do a lot of teacher trainings. And what I find is that student perspective, we're sort of constantly in that learner teacher role. And I think, leadership is just as much about that. It's the empowering and then the receiving and learning from the folks that you're guiding.
It's the continuous learning, right? Because we all evolve also as leaders and as individuals, we don't stop learning. And once we evolve from the interaction and we are really listening to the situation, to the challenges, then we can also get out of our own way and also learn new stuff and things. And when you talked, it resonated with me that from my experience lately, I understood as well that leading by example, when you're really authentic with who you are and really connect to yourself fully, it really inspires others to do the same for their own. It resonates, each and everyone touches in different places, but it creates such an enormous impact on other people, not as we want them to be, but as they take from this inspiration. So, I have a colleague that I got to know in the last 6 months, and it really inspired me to go deeper to myself, to expand, to dare to go to the unknown, beyond saying it, but also daring to be there. And said, I'm so grateful for him. And I understood it only by seeing him acting like this. It got me to want also to do this. So this is what motivated me, not with his talking, only by his presence. And I think presence is such a crucial element that we need to nourish as conscious leadership and in this arena. What do you think about it?
I love that. Yeah. And it's so interesting because there's this phrase sometimes of executive presence. And one of the things we talk about on the Radical Candor podcast, which we can talk about Radical Candor in just a moment, is that often that will sometimes mean a certain type of leader. Typically, at least in an American setting, it's often been, an older white man in a certain, more of a financial position, et cetera. And I think as we expand that definition of leadership, expanding what that authentic presence is, that is in each of us, and that, the parts of us that we often thought either don't fit in or they're outside of the norm or what's expected. In fact, that is what people gravitate towards when we are embodying that in ourselves. And I think I love that reflection you have of your colleague, and it empowers us when we hear those stories. And I think it really empowers other people that it's not about what you are saying. It is really the energy and embodiment with which you are saying or doing the thing. And, I think in our more traditional forms of leadership, being very top down, command and control, we're evolving to this more collaborative conscious leadership. And it might not be as easily spelled out because it's going to show up differently in different people.
I love it. Yes, I think that also the wisdom that emerged, right, with this, the gathering together and the learning and evolving through each other. And you touched upon the radical candor, and I do want to touch upon it because, as I found in my research, in my beyond 20 years of experience, that communication is the key for leadership, conscious leadership, and all leadership. So I'll be happy to hear from you a little bit about the method, the paradigm of candor leadership, and how it's differentiate from other communication styles and paradigms.
Sure. I was first introduced to Radical Candor by the author, Kim Scott. Kim and I actually went to business school together, although we didn't know each other at the time. And so she wrote this book about 7 years ago. And it's been not only a bestseller, but it really has developed into an executive education company. I've been chief marketing officer, chief content officer. Now I focus on our coaching and the podcast. And I think the reason why it's been so successful is that the subtitle of the book is Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. But in many ways, the way that I really translate it is that we can succeed at work without being a jerk. But it's really about, can I care about the people I work with as real human beings at the same time that I'm willing to challenge them directly? And so if you can imagine like a 2x2 matrix, right? And for your listeners, if anyone's gone into consulting or had an MBA, we joke that like just throw any of the world's largest problems into a 2x2 matrix. So you think, okay, well, I can either care about the people I work with or I can challenge them, but I can't do both of them, right? And so we think, no, what we are saying is holding that seeming paradox that I can care and I can challenge. And it really at its core is about building relationships that are based on these two principles of caring and challenging. And it can happen in one conversation that we can start to realize like, oh, I need to move up on caring, or, oh, I need to move out on challenging. And what I have found probably most helpful of the things that Kim has done, there's so many useful nuggets in there, but thinking about the mistakes that we make in a conversation when we're not practicing radical candor. So I will get into what radical candor is, but it might be helpful to talk about first what it isn't, right? And so one thing that it isn't is what we would call obnoxious aggression. This is high challenge, low care. You could say acting like a jerk. Now, originally, Kim was going to call this the asshole quadrant of radical candor. She didn't for two important reasons. One, it's not a very nice word, although you could argue it's a little more clear. But the main reason is this is not a personality test. I think I want your listeners to really think about that these are behaviors. These are ways that we are communicating with each other. And so we all can act like this. I have written the very obnoxious email to the CEO saying how a project owner was wasting millions of dollars on a project. It was a public email. I had been very frustrated. I hadn't felt listened to, but there's still no reason to do something that sort of public criticism versus going directly to the person. So that's what we call obnoxious aggression. It's kind of front stabbing. It's saying something in a meeting in front of everyone, right? And so you've embarrassed that person.
Yeah.
Now, can you relate to that mistake, that idea of obnoxious aggression? Yeah. Often what happens, and we all have, we can all behave in these quadrants. After we've acted like a jerk, we land over in manipulative insincerity. Manipulative insincerity is really when we're not caring and we're not challenging. And I would say at the far outreaches, and we see this a lot in like TV shows where it's the office politics and the gossip and even the really like political behavior or the backstabbing. But most of the time, this shows up where we say something in a meeting and we're like, oh, yeah, great idea. And then we go complain about it to someone behind their back, or we're talking about someone and not to them. And this one I think is really interesting when I lead workshops. Like, why do we behave that way? Why are we, for me, when I've acted this way, and just as I give an example where I'd been working on this big technology project, the one that I had talked about was very frustrating, very frustrating. And I had been doing research for years and content strategy for years, but there were so many technical problems that they weren't able to focus on that. So the project was ongoing. I was still in the organization, but I was in a new role. And a new person comes onto the team and says, oh, the reason this project failed was because there was no research. Now, I knew there had been research. I'd spent years doing the research. I'd spent more years trying to explain it. But rather than caring, rather than challenging, I just said, oh, good luck. And it really required me to hold a mirror up to myself of, what is happening here? You're so burnt out. Like, what do you need to do to fill your cup so that you can act in a way that really going back to that North Star, that really aligns with your values? And I think, it can be fun to tell stories when we act like a jerk. It can be fun to tell stories when we act in the other quadrant, which is ruinous empathy, where you care so much, you don't want to tell the person because you don't want to hurt their feelings. And I've got lots of those stories because that's probably the mistake I make the most. But there's something about really looking at ourselves and like, why don't we do those things? What is getting in the way of us really living into our values? Especially, if we're committed to being conscious leaders, what gets in the way of it? And so I find this a very practical framework when we look at the mistakes, the damage that those mistakes can do to our relationships, to our well-being at work. Nobody wants to wake up at work feeling like everyone's talking about them, or, just we think about psychological safety and trust. And so one of the things we do to start is think about, like, what does radical candor look like for you? Think about someone who has provided you guidance in a way that was caring and challenging, or think about someone that you would actually appreciate getting feedback from. Like, what is it that they do? And so I'm going to pause here. I mean, I can certainly share my story, but I'm curious, as I say that to you, Karen, like, what pops into mind for you? Like, are there people or behaviors that pop up that look like that idea of caring and challenging?
I'll tell you two things that pops for me. First of all, it's, as I see it, what are you talking about? The radical candor, it's the ability, it connects back to the presence. And what I found in my research, the ability of the leader to put presence and hold the tensions. Because we're in a paradoxical paradigm, right? It's not all caring or demanding. No, the invitation nowadays is to be both caring and both demanding, and to find it through the communication conversation. So to hold it both together, and from this conversation to find the right solution. It's like, holding the tension between the short term and the long term, between speed and quality. There's so much tensions in the workplace, right? But now
Yes.
delving into the communication aspect, and I really love it. Because, the second thing that comes to my mind when you talk, it's, as I evolved, I learned that actually putting boundaries, challenging people, putting them a mirror in front of their eyes, it's actually an act of compassion, because you're really helping them to evolve. Because the other fact that you said, it's not saying anything and going talking with their boss. So what did you do here? You didn't help them. You didn't give them the tools to develop and evolve. You only ruined their prestige. And yeah, I must be honest and say that at the beginning of my career, I didn't see it like this. Like, even
Totally.
Right? Even firing him,
Yeah.
letting go of an employee. If it's not a good place for him, I better let him go, because it's a compassion act, because my intention is that he will find the right place for him and the company will find the right person for them. So it's a compassion act. And I think a lot of people, and now in my courses, I talk about it, because we also have a compassion meditation. And it's something that unfolded for me, and the understanding that the ability to challenge people and to confront them, you actually giving them a present, and you need to have courage and dare to do this. And I think not everybody dares to do this, because it's not always comfortable to do it. What do you think about it?
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned a few important phrases, the courage, the compassion. I mean, another way to think about radical candor is compassionate candor. The compassion is really that caring personally. Candor is the challenge directly. And another way to think about challenge directly is what you were talking about, which is clarity, which is where the practice of mindfulness really enables us to get more and more clear. You also said something very important. I am doing this in service of empowering this person, in service of their growth. Before I'm sharing with this person, am I doing this in a way that is helpful? Am I doing this to further their growth? Or am I doing this just because I'm really pissed off and they need to see it my way, right? Versus, am I going into this conversation? I am here to share my perspective. I think this would be helpful for you. And by the way, you might have a different perspective, and that is fine. This is really about sharing our candid perspectives. And one of the things that we'll often do in our workshops is we will have people think about these times, these moments. And often people are like, gosh, I don't have a lot of these moments. To your point, I wish Kim had written the book, when I was first starting out. We learn so much from our mistakes, but it really does give this frame of holding this tension and these paradoxes. And so that's why it's really about a journey, a destination. Can I be more caring? Can I be more clear? Like, we're not going to get it right. We're not going to get it perfect. And I think holding that framework in our mind is so helpful. The other really important piece is that radical candor is measured not at my mouth as the person offering it, but how is it landing for the other person. This is why we want to do this in real time. We want to see the nonverbals, the body language. We do not want to be breaking up with people by text or in Slack. This is a back and forth. This is like communication, sharing our perspective. It's a two-way street. And I think it's really interesting to think about. If it would be helpful, I could share a quick story.
Yes, I'd be happy.
When I received some radical candor, and this was, back in my kind of early days. I'd recently graduated from Harvard Business School. And, like any graduate of Harvard Business School, I thought I was, the greatest thing that had ever come into the workplace, had a little bit of humility to learn along the way. I was running this big marketing project, a big website launch. After the meeting, my boss, he was the chief marketing officer, Steve, he asked how I thought the meeting went. I said, meeting was amazing, because the CEO and the CFO were there and they were really excited. The CEO was getting great feedback, CFO happy with the numbers. And then he asked what I thought Brooke and Jenny thought of the meeting. They were on my team. Brooke was doing the numbers. Jenny was doing the content. I said, oh, they thought the meeting was great. We were really excited. He said, did you notice that the CEO asked Jenny about the content? She started talking and you interrupted her. And I got really defensive. And I was like, yeah, I interrupted her. She was rambling. And he's a really busy guy. I was like, that was that. He, again, very patient, said, did you notice that the CFO asked Brooke about the numbers? They were right in front of him. You didn't let Brooke answer. Now, at that point, I have not yet shared that I am a recovering perfectionist. I hate to make mistakes. And at that moment, I started feeling just waves of shame and horror, because I realized, oh my gosh, like, this meeting did not go well at all. And then he asked, what do you think was happening for Brooke and Jenny the last 10 minutes of the meeting? And you know what, Karen, I realized I had no idea. I was laser focused on the CEO and the CFO, the most important people, totally ignored my team. He said, Amy, they look like they wanted to be anywhere but there. They were furious. You've really got to check in with them. And oh my gosh, what a gift. I mean, yes, it felt a bit like a kick in the stomach in the moment, but if I hadn't followed up with them as he encouraged me to do, I would have lost my team. And, Steve said to me in that moment, he said, Amy, I love how competitive you are. I know how much you really do care. And I know you can be a great leader, but a great leader lets their people shine. And so he really, when you think about that empowerment and that challenge, like in service of growth, was really giving me the opportunity to really live into what he saw was possible. Now, it didn't mean it didn't sting in the moment. One of the things that we talk about in Radical Candor is that we want to start having these conversations more frequently. And by the way, far more praise than criticism. And especially if we're leaders, we actually want to start by asking for feedback. I know I shared a story when my boss was giving me criticism, but we really actually want to start by asking for feedback. That's actually job one, so that we can start to get into this habit of realizing, oh, like you said, feedback is a gift. This is how we grow. So if, how could I be a better podcast guest for you, Karen? Right? Like, what's one thing I could do that would have made that a more succinct or effective story, right? So asking for feedback, modeling how we receive it, giving more praise than criticism. So it really can move from just these one-off, once a year conversations into ongoing relationship building.
Thank you. I love the story, and you're a perfect guest on my end. So it's amazing.
There's always something we can do better, but
I'm not a perfectionist. I let it go. So I love.
All right, I have to learn that one from you then.
So yes, we're enjoying a conversation, and that's what's important. And as we talked at the beginning, energy moves and resonate, and there's a good energy and a lot of great stuff that you're saying. And I really love the example, because at the end of the day, examples help us understand the concept and what to do with it. And as you said, shared with us the example, I could feel the unpleasant feeling to get this reflection. But actually, at the end of the day, it was a present for you, right? Because you could evolve and adopt new skills and reflect upon yourself. And this is what it means to be conscious, right? And mindful to ourselves. And this is what it means to grow and evolve and let go of our ego and behaviors that doesn't serve us anymore. So it's a really interesting and important practice. And, at the end of the day, we want people to show up fully and to dare to share with us their feelings, their thoughts. And I love it that you make it a norm in the culture that you really ask for feedback, because to be honest, at the beginning of my career, I was really vulnerable getting feedback. Didn't have high esteem. So everything that people told me, I took it really personally, and I didn't take it in a good way. But this was my way in learning to evolve and growing, to understand, first of all, to increase my self-esteem and let go of belief system and behaviors that didn't serve me anymore. And at the same time, as I evolved and increased my presence, I understood that this is actually a present for me. And even that it's not comfortable, being able to learn new things and to adopt new skills and abilities enabled me to show up as a better version of myself. So I think this is a process of evolvement. I think people at the beginning of the career it will be much more challenging for them to get this feedback. So as you said, we need to invite them in a gentle way to create this space for them to show up, to ask them questions, as your manager actually did, right? He asked you questions. What was your experience? How did you see it? And actually invited you for this reflection. And another thing, before I ask you another question, what came to my mind when you talked about communication, actually when I teach in my courses the mindful communication, I really invite people to create another layer. Like there are two layers. There's the rational layer, thinking, cause and effect, but it's the emotional layer, right? And we usually don't speak our emotions, let alone we don't understand what we are feeling, right? So it needs to begin by being mindful to our emotions, to our sensation, understanding what I'm feeling in this moment, what is the emotion that arises within me, and then we can speak it out loud. Like when he told you about the content and there's not enough research, you were hurt. So I could say, it's really frustrating for me because I really worked hard on this project. And by saying that, you actually canceled what I did until now. So, and I learned that by speaking our emotion, we decrease the antagonism from the other side because we don't go against them. We're only showing up more fully. What do you think about it?
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I love that you brought emotion in. When we do our workshops, we will say to people, these are not, when we give some guidance, we try not to give specific, sometimes people want, tell me exactly what to say. It's like, well, give you some guidance, but these are not magic words. People are going to have emotional responses, and it's how we show up when there's the emotion that's really going to build the relationship. And what we typically find, and you might find this in your own research and your own experience, is we tend to find sort of two buckets of responses. One is that emotional response, whether it's sadness or anger, frustration, and just the importance of acknowledging the emotion of really moving up on that care personally. I think the simplest thing to do, so often what we want to do is maybe we end up, rather than we back off on the challenge, someone gets upset that we're giving them more work and they start crying and we're like, oh, don't worry about it. I'll just stay up all night and do it. So we end up backing off the challenge rather than, like you're saying, meet the emotion with compassion. Same thing if someone gets really angry at us, rather than meeting that emotion with compassion, they start yelling at us, we start yelling at them, right? And so I think when there's any kind of emotion, thinking about what would work for you. And we, in fact, like as a company, we talk about like, if I'm feeling a strong emotion, what would be helpful? I'm with you. I like to talk about it. Kim, for example, Kim Scott, she doesn't like to focus on it. And I had an example with my boss, Jason Rosoff, who's our CEO. And there was a project that he was announcing, and I was surprised that I hadn't been involved in the project. So I was going into this conversation and, usually I give the guidance to people, really think through, what do you want to say and what was the context and what did you observe and what's the key result and what's the next step. But I didn't even do any of that. I just was so convinced that it was so obvious. Like, why wouldn't you include me? So I go into the conversation, why didn't you include me? And his response was, I'm really surprised that you feel that way. And I'm feeling frustrated. And I was like, I'm really surprised you feel that way. And I'm feeling very frustrated. And so we kind of went back and forth and, we both are like, have the capacity and the ability to have those conversations. And we ended up having such a wonderful conversation, but that has taken a good bit of work, to your point, of like building your own self-awareness, building your emotional management and regulation, working with people that have that capacity. And so part of it is, people are going to be at different stages in their ability to manage emotions, to work through emotions. And so I think as a conscious leader, part of what we can do, going back to your idea of like embodiment and presence, is really modeling it, giving them space for that, and really, supporting them through that, because it does, to your point, like it takes time to build those muscles.
Amazing. I couldn't agree with you more. Leading by example, right? So if my employee doesn't know to, or doesn't feel comfortable speaking his emotions, if I as a leader will speak my emotions, it will give legitimation for him to show up also fully. And maybe the first time he won't know what to do with it, but along the road, he will adopt it and learn from it. And then we create a new language and a new environment, right? For everybody to show up and to confront, and that's okay.
Yeah. I love that idea of a new language. One of the things I love doing about these train the trainers is I hear so many different stories. And I had one of the participants who worked in a manufacturing floor, and he and his boss, they've figured out a language when he's feeling a lot of emotion. It's like, take a lap. It's like they know, and that for him is like, that's the sign of like to work through the emotions. And so again, this is why these are one-on-one conversations. How I'm going to process my emotion is going to be different than you, than that, than Jason, than Kim, whomever. And so I think that's part of what we're doing in Radical Candor and in the work that you do, is understanding for each person, what does care personally look like? What does challenge directly look like? How can we best support and empower you?
Amazing, Amy. I can speak with you for hours. It's really intriguing for me, but we need to wrap up. So before we wrap up, is there any question that I didn't ask you and you want to refer to?
That's always such a great question. I think if people want to learn more about Radical Candor, certainly go ahead and get the book, Radical Candor. We've also got the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And I would encourage you to just think for yourself, who's that boss that you loved working with? What is it that this person does? Maybe it's a mentor along the way. Start to think for yourself, what does care personally and challenge directly look like for you? And then start to share those stories and reflections with the people that you work with. And that's how we can start to build more radically candid environments. And don't forget to ask for feedback.
Amazing, Amy. And another thing that I want to add is really understanding that it's not a fixed equation, right? As you said, each and every interaction will be different, and that's okay. And having the courage to understand that sometimes transparent communication is messy, and it's okay. We need to go through this mess in order to create clarity, right? So it's okay to ponder then to be confrontation, right?
I love that you said that. So often we avoid these conversations because we're afraid they're going to damage the relationship. And in fact, what we have found, certainly what I have found working at Radical Candor, these conversations strengthen relationships. Avoiding things does not strengthen relationships, but getting through it and realizing like, oh, wow, we're even closer. This is how I build trust, because the person's thinking it anyhow. Now we actually know what's on their mind, and we can have a back and forth, and we will come through it together. Maybe not in one conversation, maybe not in two conversations, but we are building and growing the relationship together.
So true. Amy, thank you very much for your experience and wisdom. I really enjoyed our conversation.
I loved it. Thank you, Karen.
Hope you enjoyed the conversation. You're invited to subscribe to our podcast in order to know when we upload a new episode, and follow us on social media. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care and bye-bye.